I hope you'll catch his books. They're fantastic on illicit finance, even a novel. Tom Cottamone, Director of Global Financial Integrity. Jerome Beaumont, the Executive Secretary of Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence. Elizabeth Frankow Jaskowicz, Head of the International Cooperation Unit within the Department of Financial Information of the Polish Ministry of Finance. She is also the interim chair of the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence. And Mr. Mariano Federici, the Senior Manager Director of K2 Integrity and the former chairman of the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units. A very outstanding panel on illicit finance. You will learn much from these great individuals, so carry on.
Congressman Pittenger, parliamentarians and participants, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. You know, over the last day and a half, we've had some outstanding presentations, really interesting subject matters. But one thing that struck me is how often China has come up in all of our conversations. It's worth noting particularly because the speakers have been very diverse. The countries they represent are very diverse. They have various fields of expertise, but nevertheless, China seems to be the common denominator. Now, we've talked about China as a military threat. We've talked about China as an economic threat. We've talked about China as a commercial threat, human rights threat, information technology. But one thing we really haven't talked about at all is what I call China as a transnational criminal threat and a big money laundering threat. And that's my background. I've been in international law enforcement for about 30 years or so, specializing in international money laundering. And over the last few years, I've become increasingly concerned about how the international community has seemingly ignored what I call China, CCP Inc., transnational crime, and money laundering. In fact, this last year, I released a book called just that, China's Specified Unlawful Activities, CCP Inc., Transnational Crime and Money Laundering. In that book, I looked at the 12 largest categories of transnational crime, things that you're all familiar with, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, illegal fishing, counterfeit, intellectual property rights violations, and many others. And in 11 of those 12 categories of transnational crime, China leads the world. China, CCP Inc., China actors lead the world. Then I also looked at what I call Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies and enablers. Now, in this panel, we're going to be discussing illicit trade, illicit finance and illicit trade. So what I'm going to talk about in the time I have allocated to me is just make a few points about illicit finance, illicit trade as it relates to CCP Inc., specifically trade-based money laundering. So let me begin by talking just a little bit about trade fraud, because it's perhaps the most extensive or widespread form of Chinese and global money laundering. And it comes from trade misinvoicing. Trade fraud is also what we call a specified unlawful activity or predicate offense to charge money laundering. Depending on its form, it can also be a money laundering methodology itself. In fact, I believe it is the largest and most widespread money laundering methodology in the world. It's also the least recognized, understood, and enforced. Most forms of trade misinvoicing revolve around invoice fraud and manipulation. Generally speaking, invoice fraud means the contents, the description, and/or the value of the goods have been deliberately misrepresented. This is done for a number of reasons, but primarily it's to get minimize taxes, duties, VAT fraud, promote export incentive fraud. It's part of alternative remittance systems, parallel banking systems, this type of thing. Now, China is the largest trading nation in the world. In 2022, according to the CCP's own numbers, even factoring in the worldwide pandemic, China's foreign trade volume hit a reported high of about $6 trillion. How much of that represents trade fraud? Well, we don't know, because getting reliable data out of China and about China is problematical, and enforcement relating to Chinese trade fraud is very, very limited. In addition, trade-based money laundering, trade fraud, can be very complex because the launderers hide behind individual transactions within the vast volume of legitimate trade. For example, general merchandise trade in 2022 totaled about 22 trillion US dollars in exports alone. Another reason why it's so hard to get accurate numbers and to follow the money and value trail is because traders transfers monies across borders, often using multiple currencies with very complex financing. But using a conservative estimate, I'm going to use 10%. I'm not going to tell you how I got that because it's too time consuming. But using a very conservative estimate that 10% of China's trade is suspect or involved with trade fraud, that could mean possibly suspect Chinese trade is approximately $600 billion a year. $600 billion a year. That's an enormous number, but next to nothing is being done about it. Also think how much trade fraud is costing your governments in, say, tax and duty, VAT fraud, this type of thing. Now let's turn to capital flight. Similar to trade fraud, by far China leads the world in capital flight. From 2006 to 2016, an estimated $4 trillion left China. $4 trillion in capital left China. Already this year, the capital outflow has been the largest since 2015. This quarter has been particularly brutal for CCP Inc. Most of this is due to economic and political uncertainties, their collapsing real estate market, terrible return on investments for traditional Chinese internal investments, savings vehicles. And the CCP Inc. has responded. They've had capital controls for years, capital flight restrictions for years, yet even middle-class Chinese use very creative means to get their hard-earned capital out of the country. Some people think that capital flight isn't money laundering, and for the most part it isn't, but a lot of it actually is. Capital flight could be considered money laundering because a lot of the capital that's leaving China is the proceeds of crime. In anti-money laundering, we talk about mixing or commingling illicit with licit. And if some of it's tainted, then the whole pot is in effect dirty money. Now, to the point of going back to illicit trade and illicit finance, the point of this is that Chinese often use trade fraud or value transfers in ways to circumvent capital flight controls. For example, in trade-based money laundering, to move money and value out, actors import goods at overvalued prices or export goods at undervalued prices. This happens constantly with Chinese traders. Now, I want to briefly mention China's massive involvement in global black market exchanges. Last year at this forum, I provided some details about the evolution of the Colombian black market peso exchange and how forms of this exchange have spread around the world. I'm sure they affect your countries. In these international exchanges, illicit proceeds are increasingly used to purchase Chinese trade goods directly from China or from international businesses or Chinese brokers. There's willful blindness on the part of the Chinese vendors and brokers. They really don't care where the money comes from, the origin of the money. They just want to complete the deal. A further worrisome spin on these black market exchanges is the use of Chinese apps, such as WeChat Pay on mobile phones. Chinese brokers working with the cartels identify a Chinese business person working in a host country that has a cash-intensive business. The broker gives the proceeds of crime to the business person who launders it through his or her business accounts. And using the phone app, a like amount of money in China is transferred from the business person's China account to an account designated by the broker and the transnational criminal group. It's a very, very effective money laundering scheme, one that we are hard-pressed to combat, and almost completely our anti-money laundering countermeasures simply can't keep up. And by anti-money laundering countermeasures, I primarily mean financial intelligence, and I know we're going to hear from our colleagues at the Egmont Group about that in a little bit. In this forum, I also talked a little about Chinese underground financial systems called Faiqian or flying money. Historically and culturally, flying money is also based on the misuse of trade. Now, why is this important? Well, because according to estimates put forward both by the World Bank and the IMF, unrecorded remittances could be as high as $1.5 trillion every year, as opposed to, say, recorded remittances by the Western Unions and the MoneyGrams of the world. Flying money is perhaps one of the largest, well, it is one of the largest underground remittance systems. Its use is global. Certainly it's found in the countries that you represent. Now, international flying money brokers often use the process of countervaluation or over and under invoicing to settle accounts between their brokers. This is where the trade fraud, the trade-based money laundering comes in. While flying money is often innocent, benign, certainly just used to send remittances from hard-earned workers back home, because it is so opaque and it ignores or gets around our anti-money laundering countermeasures, it's also frequently used to remit, if you will, the proceeds of crime. Now, I'm just about out of time, but I want to emphasize that there are many Chinese CCP enablers that drive money laundering. I write about them in some of my book, including the use of free trade zones, gaming, real estate investments, the use of offshores and secrecy havens, influence operations, and many, many others. Perhaps the most pernicious of all is CCP Inc. corruption. We've talked a little bit about corruption over the last day and a half. I think corruption, particularly dealing with money laundering, is the great enabler or the great facilitator. Now, many of these money laundering enablers have taken root in China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has signed more than 200 agreements in jointly building the BRI with about 152 countries and 32 international organizations, and has invested well over $1 trillion in the BRI initiative. They did not do this for friendship. Rather, there's a growing and alarming overlap between China's involvement in transnational crime and illicit finance and their rapidly expanding international presence. I believe the evidence shows, and when I mean evidence, I go back to that $2 trillion of illicit proceeds every year, which is about half of the roughly $4 trillion that is laundered every year worldwide by all sources. But I believe the evidence shows that without a doubt, China, again, CCP Inc., is the largest and most dangerous criminal actor in the world today. In law enforcement parlance, we would say it acts like an ongoing criminal enterprise. I believe CCP Inc. criminality is occurring in every country represented here. I don't understand why we continue to ignore the threat, but there is some grounds for optimism if we act on it, because I firmly believe on a tactical level, this is where CCP Inc. is most vulnerable. going after them at the criminal level. Thank you.